Hi, my name is Michaela Gisela. I am a student in Professor Trulis' political, or not political, sorry, American government class, so starting like way at the bottom. I'm a freshman, and before I came to U, I lived on the reservation, so we didn't have too much of this, we didn't hear too much about this Occupy issue out there. But what I want to know is what exactly makes these Occupy movements, like the actual gatherings, or I don't know how to say it, what makes them like legal or illegal in the perspective of like the police and how they regulate it, if that makes sense.
I can tackle the specific issue, and I'll let you handle the big questions. Specifically, I mean, generally for a protest to be legal, there needs to be a permit. And this is part of what Professor Johnson was talking about with that the state likes to regulate protest and sort of keep a tabs on it. And so if you want to protest, you need to get a permit ahead of time. And depending on the permit, depending on the city, it can be a week to a month. Basically, you have to plan your spontaneous act, right? And you tell the police, the city, exactly how many people you expect to be there, ostensibly so they can plan police presence and toilets and things like that. And if you deviate from the permit, you are then outside the law, and that enables the police to, if they choose to, and this is important, if they choose to suppress or repress the protesters. And so, you know, when occupiers arrived at Pioneer Square, I thought to myself, well, that's a bad choice, right? Nothing happens in Pioneer Park. They should be occupying the state capitol building or setting up in front of the city county building. My sense is they got a permit for Pioneer Park, right? And that's why they went to Pioneer Park. I don't know this for a fact, but that's my guess. And they were allowed to stay there. In part, I think outside of the permit, what the permit permitted, but at some point, the city decided that they needed to crack down. They could crack down because the permit had expired or something like that. But I think there's a backstory to that too.
And maybe before we get to the larger philosophical issues, I think that it's because there is so much variation with the original Occupy movement in New York. They chose Zuccotti Park because it's a privately owned park that is publicly mandated to be open 24 hours a day, versus a big park like Central Park, which is much more symbolically powerful in New York City. You can't spend the night there, but you could spend the night in Zuccotti Park. So just because of that nuance in the law, they decided that's going to be a great place. It's very close to the heart of the financial district, very close to Wall Street itself. And so they were able to be there for as long as they could until they were deemed to be contributing to health and sanitation problems. And that was the premise by which they were rated. And that was, similarly in Salt Lake, someone died in Pioneer Park. And so that health hazard, that was deemed to be constitutive of a health hazard. And so that was the reason they closed it down. But I think it's a deep irony that these that you have to do all of this legally when you're sort of protesting against the laws. And so it forces you into kind of an uncomfortable corner, I think.
And I think building what Professor Holtzner said, I think there's a way in which those who are involved in the Occupy movement, this puts them in something of a bind, should actually, I think, try to ignore that question. Namely that I think democratic citizenship at its best is oftentimes about taking. It's about taking things. And so here, when we're talking about occupying public space, and it's kind of a taking over public space, they should not be seeking permits. That in itself is a symptom or a sign of just how devalued politics is, just how problematic it's thought to be. And that is a remarkable phenomenon, or a remarkable fact, if you think about it in that way. And so that, of course, then opens them up to all sorts of retaliation, to sanctions. But that could also actually be a good thing. That could actually backfire and actually help energize the moment. But that citizens actually need permission to engage in politics is profoundly objectionable, and that might even become another part of the Occupy movement itself, as Professor Holtzner was talking about, that it's not enough to be engaged in politics just every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years, not enough just to go to an election booth, but it needs more direct involvement on a regular basis. But I also think it needs a certain kind of attitude, it needs a certain kind of a disposition, and it's one that does not ask permission from the authorities to be spontaneous, as you, I think, quite brilliantly put it. So.
All right, fourth row, second seat.
So this discussion then naturally leads to the question of civil disobedience, because what we're talking about is laws that we might consider inappropriate or constraining or limited or produced by a form of government that has not been effectively representative and so forth. And so the only way to deal with those laws is, in effect, to disobey some of those laws. And that gets us to the whole issue of civil disobedience. That's how the whole civil rights movement worked out. I mean, they were illegal. Everything they were doing was illegal in certain respects at certain levels. And so I'd like your take on civil disobedience.
Well, I think we would not want to necessarily adopt the mantle of civil disobedience here, at least not immediately, because there's a way in which I think the Occupy movement goes well beyond civil disobedience. We're talking about a critique of a society as a whole, and I realize that there's an element of that with the civil rights movement as well, but I think this even goes beyond that. I think this is now so profound that I think we would underplay it if we talked about this in terms of civil disobedience. I think it's more a question of the politics of justice and of fairness and of what is right. And think of the statistics that Professor Stewart put up there. I mean, those are just absolutely extraordinary. The relocation of wealth that has taken place, at least since, say, the Reagan years, that it's just been truly extraordinary that the Republican Party in particular, but with a lot of assistance from Democrats, has just been waging brutal, relentless, and highly successful class warfare. I mean, it's just staggering the success that they've been able to enjoy with relative immunity, as far as I can tell. So I think civil disobedience doesn't quite capture what's going on here. It's much broader than that. That would be at least my take on it.
And what I would say about that is that I think the civil rights movement, the civil disobedience aspects of it, were targeting specific laws that were unjust, right? And they were morally objectionable, and they didn't actually pass constitutional muster, right? And so I think the issues are much more muddled. The multiple issues and the multiple grievances that are being raised, not all of them lend themselves to to a civil disobedience frame. I think a different frame would be, it's about civil engagement or civic engagement, right? That the solution doesn't come from a kind of civic engagement, which civil disobedience is, but it's sort of from a continuous, challenging, disruptive, not always disruptive, but always engaged action by ordinary citizens. And that's how we're going to change things. And it should be legal, could be legal, but it's a carving out, it's an expanding and enlarging. This is the goal, I think, an enlarging of the voice of ordinary citizens. And that doesn't have to be through civil disobedience. I think it can be quite civil, in fact, right?
Although I would say, thinking about that question, I think the key word you said was disruptive. And so I think that the theorists that most fundamentally speak to this issue is Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, who wrote a book called Poor People's Movements in the 1970s. And basically their analysis was that if there is a system that is disadvantaging people, and if those people don't have access to those institutions, the only way they can make their voice heard is by disruption. And so they said, don't run for Congress, don't become a union leader. You need to, if those are the institutions that are disadvantaged, well, they wouldn't have used unions as an example, but they were basically saying that and I think they were very prophetic in the way they analyzed the U.S. political system, which they said that for most people are excluded from economic and political power. So therefore, you can't just participate because the rules of the game are structured so decisively against you that by participating, you are reinforcing and condoning those kinds of institutions, and so the only thing you can do is disrupt it. And so Frances Fox Piven, she's been pilloried by Fox and all kinds of conservative news outlets, because she basically says, you need to stand up and disrupt, and that is the only thing you can do. And I think that the complexity of the Occupy movements is that that's one strand that I think is really profound, but it's not the only one. But I think that the legacy of the civil rights movement taken today is this message of disruption. So that's what I would say.
On this one,